Hey, what is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Hope you are having a fantastic day out there. In today's video, I wanted to go through a couple of very basic concepts of object-oriented programming, which is a pretty broad concept in and of itself, right? So the first topic I wanted to go through and teach you is how we can use classes and objects to sort of model out some logic of how our program should work. And then I'm going to move on to how we can define protocols or interfaces to sort of create rules as to how objects can interact with each other. Now, because object-oriented programming is such an abstract concept, I think the best way to understand what's going on is to go through a real-world example. So in today's video, I wanted to walk you through just a very simple scenario of someone going to the grocery store to pick up some grocery items, and the grocery store actually printing out the receipt for this customer. Alright, so this is a very basic interaction with the real world that you and I are very familiar with, right? So let's go ahead and see how we can program out the logic behind it using some object-oriented programming with Xcode right now. Okay everyone, and welcome to a brand new file of Xcode Playgrounds on the left side of your screen. And as you can pretty much see, I don't have a ton of code inside of this file just yet. If you modify this print statement to say 1, 2, 3, 4 and run your code using this play button down here, you can see some of your changes on the right side as well as the print statements on the console below. And the idea for today's video is to use this file to explain to you some of the basic concepts of object-oriented programming. So let's see, what do I want to do inside of here is to explain to you what exactly is OOP, which stands for Object-Oriented Programming, like so. Okay, so in my personal opinion, I think the easiest way to understand a lot of this stuff is to go through a real-world scenario. And the example we're going to use in today's video is the simple interaction of you and I going to a grocery store to buy some grocery items. And let's see, the first thing I want to do is to actually define the class for my grocery store, right? So we're going to use a very simple struct of grocery store to define this class. Inside of Swift, you can use a struct or a class. It doesn't matter so much for today's video, but we're just going to use a struct because it's a little simpler. And so let's see, we have a class for the grocery store. The next thing I would like to define is a class that represents a customer trying to buy items for this store. So let's define customer using a struct as well. And this customer is going to have one single property on it called name. And here we go. We have two classes for our object-oriented program. And down below, I can start defining some instances for these two classes. In other words, what I mean is I'm going to define a store called Safeway, which is a pretty famous grocery store in the United States. And you can just define this using an empty constructor like that. And let's define a customer called Bill and give him the name of Bill, like so. Alright, so pretty good stuff. If I run my program again, all we see is the print statement of this up above and nothing too much down here. Alright, so the next thing we would like to move on to is to implement some functionality for the actual grocery store. And I'm going to give this guy a function of print receipt for the parameter of customer type, like that. And this function, the implementation is going to print out receipts for grocery items for customer. Okay, so pretty good stuff there. And the thing that you have to kind of add to your program is the way for a customer to hold on to a list of groceries. So let me add that in up above with groceries. And I'm going to let this guy be of, let's see, of type any array, like this over there. So if you have this second property inside of your customer object, you can try to run your program, but it's not going to let you because this constructor now requires you to kind of fill out groceries as well. And let's say the customer of Bill is just entering the grocery store. That means that he probably isn't holding on to anything yet, so we're just going to declare an empty array like so. And let's move on to further implementing the print receipt function. And I'm just going to print out a very, very simple statement. And let's see, printing out receipt for customer. And this guy, I'm going to use something called string interpolation to get the customer's name out like that. Okay, so just one simple print statement, and this is going to allow me to say safeway.printReceipt for the customer of Bill right over there. And the moment that you run your application, you're going to see this print statement down below. So hit the play button. So running our program right now, we see this print statement down below. And what I would like to move on to now is to define some objects for our customer to actually buy. So what I mean is, let's say we define some kind of grocery item called apple, right? And that's maybe because Bill really wants to buy some apples. And let's define this class with a string. Let's see, name type string. And let's also give the apple something like price and let it be of type float. Okay, so with the apple class defined just like so, we can create an instance of apple below, and let's say green apple equals apple, and construct this with the name of green apple, and the price, let's say $1.99, which is pretty much the standard price for an apple these days. Maybe this is a little bit expensive, but nonetheless, we will pass green apple to the customer of Bill inside of his groceries bag. You can think of it that way. And right over here inside of print receipt, we would like to see how we can print out Bill's receipt with this new object. So the way to do that is to access the customer's groceries like so and execute a for each loop on this array of groceries. Hit enter, call each one of those objects item, and inside of here, what do we want to do? Well, why don't we first try to simply calculate the total of the items inside of Bill's grocery bag. So let me define this variable up here called total and set it equal to 0. At the very end, right after the loop, we can simply print out the total like so. And let's say running your application now, you will get the value of 0 right at the very end. So that's pretty good. And the thing I want to do is to simply add onto this total for every object inside of Bill's grocery bag by executing some logic. And so what you can do is to actually execute some logic on this item object. And you can, do a simple check of if item is apple, and then you can do some stuff here. So do some stuff. But this is actually kind of hard, and what you would like to do instead inside of Swift is to use this code of let apple equals item as optional apple like that. And this is called optional binding, which allows you to simply access apple.price like so. Okay, so the simple logic to kind of calculate the total is to simply say total plus equals apple.price. Hopefully that's pretty straightforward, and this should work. However, total is defaulted to be of int type, so let's change this to float, and this logic should work out. Let me run my code now, and you'll see that the total for Bill is $1.99. If you change this to, let's say, total and use string interpolation again, you can get this, say that, and run it again, you'll see the total right before the $1.99. Okay, so good stuff there. And what I would like to also do for the printing of receipt is to actually print out the item that the customer is trying to buy. In other words, I want to say something like this. So let's say apple.name, so .name, and then colon, and we'll say apple.price, I believe that property is. And if you run your code now, down below you will see the printing out of each line item for all the groceries that Bill is trying to buy, right? So that's great, and that's kind of how the object-oriented principles work. You define your classes, define your objects, and you execute some function on those objects. And the way that our program is constructed right now, we can create some additional objects like golden apple, so apple equals apple. And this guy, we have two properties to define over here. The first is the name, we'll say golden apple, and the price, let's make the golden apple really expensive with $4.99, and pass this apple to Bill as well with a comment. So we have green apple, we have golden apple, and if you run this code now, you'll have the addition of $4.99 and $1.99. So hit the play, you have green apple, golden apple, and total of $6.98. Okay, so that's sort of the first concept of object-oriented programming. We have our objects, and then we have the function of print receipt. And now what we would like to do to make this even more interesting is to define a second type of object a customer can buy. So the example I'm going to use is a different struct, and let's say you can also buy beef at the grocery store, right? So this guy also has a name of string. And the way that you typically buy beef is by the pound, and you would calculate the pound multiplied by price per pound. So let's define something called weight on here and let that be of type float. And let's say price per pound, and let that also be of type float. Okay, so let's now try to modify the function of print receipt to account for this beef object, okay? So before we can do that, let's first see how we can define something called maybe New York steak equals beef. And we have three parameters that we need to kind of declare here. The first one is going to be New York steak, and then the weight, maybe we're trying to buy 2.5 pounds. And then the price per pound, I think in the United States is roughly $9.99. And then you want to pass this New York steak into the groceries array. And if you try to run your application now, you'll see that the receipt printing is exactly the same because we haven't really accounted for the beef object inside of here yet. So let's modify this to also say else if let beef equals item as question mark beef, like so. And we can simply say total plus equals beef dot weight times beef dot price per pound. So this is the simple example that I am trying to give you in today's video. If you run your code now, you see that the total has been increased by quite a bit, right? It's $31.95 right now. So let's also modify this so that we print out the beef object right after the apples. And the way I'm going to do that is to simply say print and use string interpolation again with beef.name. And let's see, colon. Maybe the weight is something we want to know about the object. And what is this? Beef.weight. And then price per pound. Also using beef.price per pound. And try to run this now and see what we get. So we have New York steak, weight 2.5, price per pound, $9.99. And we get the total to kind of look like that. And that's pretty good. Okay, so hopefully by going through this very simple example, you can kind of understand how to calculate the total for objects such as apple and beef inside of your grocery bag. And if you take a look at this solution, you can see right away that this solution doesn't scale that well, right? Let's say, for example, you introduce a third object such as drinks. You would have to define another else case for drinks and other objects, so on and so forth. And this isn't exactly what you want to do because you can't really type out an else case for every object inside of your grocery store. So what you can do instead is to define a rule set for how your objects can sort of interact with each other. And the way I'm going to do this is to define something called a protocol right above. And this protocol will be called a grocery item. Now a protocol can define a set of functions, which I'll say function. And let's say I just define a function called cost and let it return a float type like so. All right, so the way I'm going to actually run my program is to just hit the play button and see if everything works. So everything looks good. And now I'm going to make sure that my apple and beef objects conform to this protocol, so grocery item, and just use the colon over there. If you try to run now, you will have an error over here saying that Apple needs to conform to the protocol by providing the implementation of cost. And this guy, because Apple is very simple, you just return the price. Okay, so hit the play over there and make sure that beef also conforms to grocery item. And down below you can say function, and maybe you can just type out cost. And this guy, the cost is actually the weight times price per pound for the typical calculation of, how you buy beef at the grocery store. Okay, so running this, everything should be okay. Now the next thing you want to do is to make the calculation of printing out the receipt and calculating the total to be much easier. So the way I'm going to do this is to comment out all of that. And all you gotta do is to now say if let grocery item equals item as a grocery item instead. So because grocery item, this object over here, you know that it conforms to the grocery item protocol, you can directly access the cost function like that. And what you can do is just say total plus equals grocery item dot cost. And you see we have $31.95 down below. If you run your application again, you will get $31.95 just like you kind of calculated before. And so let's say you also want to print out the line item for each one of your grocery objects. You can go back up to the protocol of grocery item and change this to also provide some kind of function, maybe called description, that returns you a string. This way you can go instead of apple, provide that using description, return the string interpolation of, let's see, name and colon, and also the price like so. That looks pretty good. For the beef object, let's say description, and this guy we will return, let's see, what did we have before? I think it was just name, and then we had colon, and I think we had weight and a colon, and let's see, maybe we didn't have the colon, but we had simply weight, and then also comma, price per pound. And we'll just do this again, price per pound. Hopefully that's pretty self-explanatory. And so now that grocery item has this description function, you can also say grocery item dot description, and you can simply print out that over there. Run your application one more time and you'll get the same print statement we had before, where you can see exactly what the grocery item is. So now that all of the logic is implemented correctly, one final thing that you can fix with your program is this if checking over here. So we are always checking if one of these items is a grocery item, but let's just kind of assume that the customer is always going to have grocery items in his grocery bag. What we can do is to just declare that array as a grocery item array instead. This way, if you try to run your application, you don't exactly have to cast this guy into that anymore. What you can simply do is to just do this instead. So each one of these items inside of your array is now a grocery item. And so you can simply say print out item.description and also total plus equals item.cost like that. So running your application one more time, you'll get the exact same print statement down below. Okay, so good stuff there, and we're pretty much done, but if you want to perform some extra cleanup with your code, what you can do is to make the calculation for total a little bit simpler. So this is something maybe a little bit more advanced, but let's say let total equals customer.groceries, and I'll use a function called reduce. So this is a pretty hard function to understand if you've never seen it before, but the way it works is you provide the initial value of 0, and we're just going to use curly brace, and I will type in $0 plus $1 dot cost like that. And if you try to run your application one more time, what you get is that your total is 3195. So this is what we refer to as higher ordered functions. And this is kind of hard to explain, but if you type in groceries. All right, so that's gonna wrap it up for today's video on the abstract idea of object-oriented programming. Now, it might seem a little bit confusing at first, but the more examples that you go through, the easier it will become to understand. And finally, if you are interested in additional Swift development lessons, make sure to check out the latest course on how to build out a podcast application using the link in the description below. And so for this course, I'm going to teach you how to build out this application over here that allows us to search through the iTunes Search API for some podcasts by typing in NPR up at the search bar, clicking into Fresh Air, loading up all of these podcasts through the JSON API, clicking into one of these podcast episodes, launching this player that plays the audio for this episode. And if you want to dismiss this, you just drag that down and drag it up. You'll get the animation just like that. And last but not least, if you want to download the source code for today's video, you can find the link in the description below as well. Thank you so much for joining me in today's lesson. I will see you in the next video. Bye bye guys.